completing a PhD in religious studies at Baylor University with a focus upon Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. His dissertation looks at the relationship between Deuteronomy's legal reasoning and Assyrian loyalty oaths. Among other outcomes, the project provides a venue for considering how ritual contributes to identity formation, which is a primary interest in forming his larger research agenda. Clay has previously taught a variety of courses related to the Christian Scriptures at Baylor University, Harding School of Theology, and Harding University. And we're very excited that he's able to be here with us today. I would also add that he hails from Nashville, unless I'm incorrect about that, and has family there now, and then also is married with 2 children. And we're just glad that you could be here today, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and as well as the interaction we're able to share with you over the next couple of hours. The topic for this first lecture in particular is Worship as Social Creativity, Reflections on the Power and Peril of Worship Innovations. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, good afternoon, Heritage Christian University. It's so good to be here. I'm really grateful for the invitation. It's an honor to get to be with you, to share some of what I've been working on recently. It's always fun when somebody asks me to do that because I don't get a lot of inquiry about my dissertation, believe it or not, you know. So anyway, I grew up just a couple of hours away from here in Nashville. My parents are actually here, so I'm really excited that they're here. And so I've got family members that support this school, and so it's such a pleasure to get to be with you this afternoon. We get a really profound opportunity today to do something that's awesome. Namely, we're going to come together on 2 separate occasions to study Scripture rigorously, based on our mutual love for God and belief that Scripture lets us know God better. And so hear me say, when I was asked by Dr. Jeremy Barrier to speak at these lectures, I was told to be rigorous, don't hold anything back. So we're not going to do that. I'm going to show you, hopefully, some cutting-edge research. First, related to the book of Psalms, Psalm 79, we're going to do some interdisciplinary work, looking at the sociology of ritual and some trauma theory. And then later, looking at the book of Deuteronomy, looking at recent research on the book of Deuteronomy. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to be rigorous and to hopefully share with you a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing. But before I go any further, I want to get one thing straight from the outset of our time together. And that is my belief that scholarship is meaningless to me. It's meaningless to me if it does not result in a greater love for God and a greater love for others. What's the point? You likely remember Jesus' encounter with a scholar of the law, right, who asked him, what is the greatest commandment in all of the law? And that's really a question of hermeneutics, right? It's a question of interpretation, right? Out of 613 or so commandments in the Torah, and then generations of scholars and scribes and prophets that have interpreted that Torah, what's your framework, right? What's your defining framework for interpreting that Torah? And Jesus' response is given in Matthew 22, 37 through 40. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your minds. The first and greatest commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these 2 commandments. I think it's an important precedent set by Jesus. It's a precedent that I hope can set the tone for our discussions today. And so even before I tell you about my research in this first presentation, I want to tell you actually about a community that I love, that has most directly inspired my research agenda. And this community is the Robinson Church of Christ. So my family started attending Robinson in the fall of 2018 when I began my PhD work at Baylor. We were really impressed by this church when we first were there that Sunday because an elder immediately asked us to go to dinner with them. I mean, it was just like first thing. They wanted us to go to dinner with them. And so this was a really good sign to us, as my wife and me, that this was a church where their leadership prioritized shepherding, right? They prioritized hospitality. Now, little did I know that a complex array of forces were going to converge early in our time at Robinson that would prove to be immensely challenging and draining for this faith community. So much so that the doors came very close to shutting on multiple occasions while we were there. So these forces included, but were certainly not limited to, a global pandemic. You remember the one. Declining numbers of young families, which was a snowball effect, right? Because those families that were there they were being drained. And so then they would leave and go elsewhere. And then that would put more tension on other families with kids. Heightened political tensions. We had a really significant political divide at our church and some people that were not very tactful about their views. We had some well-meaning but consequential missteps by some of the church's leadership. I think that's fair to say. And so in a few short years after we emerged from the pandemic, this church had declined from about 200, maybe around 250 at points, members, to around 75 or so at one point while we were there, maybe even less. So you can imagine how painful this decline was for members that had attended Robinson for decades. Friendships were broken. Our church's finances were strained significantly. And then each Sunday was a painful reminder of what we had lost. I stuck around, my family stuck around during the pandemic, and I was thrust into a rather precarious position. Remember, we had lost the vast majority of our members. No one wanted to lead worship. We had a worship leader that stuck around for a while during the pandemic, but again, he had young kids. He decided to go elsewhere, totally get it. So here I was, a willing, maybe somewhat reluctant leader of a weekly event that was increasingly painful. Why was it painful? Well, it was painful because usually we would go into an auditorium that didn't look like this. This is the end of the story, so I'll share with this picture with you in just a little bit. It was more like this. This was our auditorium, just empty pews. A vast, gaping auditorium that was supposed to seat hundreds. It was demoralizing. I mean, it was completely demoralizing. Every week, our worship was a reminder of what we had lost. And so worship became painful. Now, it was during this time that I wrote perhaps the most important paper of my career to this point, my short career. But this one, I see this paper as a sort of foundation to everything that I do, all of my research. This is a paper that I think is a thesis that I'm interested in exploring further in all of the subsequent work that I do. And in fact, as you're going to see even in the second presentation when we talk about Deuteronomy, this paper on the book of Psalms is a paper that informs even my work on the book of Deuteronomy. It's a paper that's called Worship as Social Creativity, Social Identity, and the Form of Psalm 79. Paper began as most good biblical studies papers do, I think. I was translating Psalm 79, right? I was translating the text from Hebrew into English. And I was just slowing down and reading the text closely because that's what translation work does, right? I mean, it forces you to slow down, to parse out every single word. And so I noticed while reading the text slowly something very odd about the logic of this text. Put simply, it felt incredibly disoriented. The text was it was like the logic didn't make sense. It was jumping from one topic to another, and it made me pause. I think we should take a look at the psalm for a bit ourselves. Now, before I talk to you about those disoriented stipulations, we'll get there in just a moment, but I think it makes sense to begin by reading verses 1 through 4, which gives a bit about the setting, right, the assumed setting of this psalm. So the text says this. It's a psalm of Asaph. O God, the nations have come into your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They've laid Jerusalem in ruins. They've given the bodies of your servants to the birds of the air for food, the flesh of your faithful to the wild animals of the earth. They've poured out their blood like water all around Jerusalem. There was no one to bury them. We have become a taunt to our neighbors, mocked and derided by those all around us. So a word about the historical context of this psalm. I think verse 1 is probably most helpful in this regard because it describes the defilement and destruction of Jerusalem and its holy temple. Now, when we think about the history of ancient Israel, ancient Judah, and we think about at what point in their history do we have the temple being defiled and Jerusalem being in some kind of ruins, right, being attacked and destroyed? The most logical historical referent for this event, it seems to me, is the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of its temple in 587, 586 BCE at the hands of the Babylonians. And there's certainly other occasions where Jerusalem is attacked by the nations or pressured by the nations. I mean, we might think, for example, of the Assyrian king Sennacherib and the siege of Jerusalem in 701 BCE during the reign of Hezekiah. And in that event, I mean, the temple's involved. Hezekiah seems to take some funds from the temple in order to pay off Sennacherib, which seems to work. But again, Assyria doesn't destroy the temple or defile it necessarily in any kind of literal way. Moreover, most of the times in the Hebrew Bible, this event is celebrated, right? God has delivered Jerusalem from the hands of these oppressors. But here, there's some different tone, right? I mean, the temple is defiled, the city is destroyed, it's in ruins. And so for me, as if we're going to take verse 1 at face value, the psalmist seems to be describing the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 587, 586 BC. If you're an observant reader, though, maybe you look at the superscription of the psalm, a psalm of Asaph, you might recognize, well, in the exile, it didn't occur during the life of Asaph, and this is a psalm of Asaph, so what's going on here? Well, Asaph is not the most well-known character from the Old Testament, so you're forgiven if you're not familiar with him. There are, though, in fact, 12 psalms connected with him. That is to say, we have a title or a superscription attached to 12 psalms of Asaph. Asaph was a prominent Levite. He was a singer in David's court, King David's court. He's also an ancestor of an apparently important group of people who lived after the exile, known as the sons of Asaph. This is a great family kind of temple guild, responsible for leading worship or creating music of some kind, it seems. And we know a lot about Asaph from the book of Chronicles, where, among other things, he and his brothers are appointed to sing the songs of thanksgiving to the Lord. So this is talked about actually in 1 Chronicles. I've got it listed at the top, 1 Chronicles 16, verses 4 through 7. And then in Ezra 2:41, Nehemiah 7:44, the temple singers during the post-exilic period, that is after the Babylonian exile and after the return from exile of those in captivity. Again, this is a group simply referred to as the sons of Asaph, those who are musicians, temple musicians in the post-exilic period. So we seem to have this family of post-exilic worship musicians that trace their heritage all the way back to an ancestor living during the time of David named Asaph. To that end, you may notice that the title of the psalm, a psalm of Asaph, Mismor le'Asaph, it's really ambiguous. What does that mean, right? A psalm of Asaph. I mean, it could mean that Asaph wrote this psalm, but it could also mean a psalm associated with Asaph and his family. It could also mean a psalm sung in the style of Asaph, right? It's just a psalm and then the preposition for or of, and then Asaph. So what does it mean? Well, again, it's not clear from the grammar alone. So I leave it up to you what you think about who wrote the psalm. But as I read about the destruction of Jerusalem, the defilement of the temple, I take this to be a reference to the destruction wrought upon God's people during the Babylonian exile. And probably then this is a psalm written by these sons of Asaph during the post-exilic period, a group of people that trace their lineage back to Asaph. Okay, so all of that is well and good. Again, I'm happy for you to disagree with me on what you think the historical context is for this psalm. But I don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture for God's people here, especially as it pertains to the suffering that's being described in this psalm. Because regardless of the specific event being described, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the horrific trauma experienced by the psalmist and his community. To this end, we might look at verse 2. They've given the bodies of your servants to the birds of the air for food, the flesh of your faithful to the wild animals of the earth. This is anticipating our second presentation. This is right here. This is a curse that you see regularly in ancient Near Eastern treaties. If you break the terms of a treaty, may your flesh, your corpse be left out so that the jackals, the wild animals, will eat them, right? Deprive you of a good burial. There are implications of this, right? For your honor, your sense of honor, right? You're not receiving an honorable burial. There may be some notion of also like, well, the afterlife. Maybe this might impact your well-being after life. I'll point out one other thing about this that I think is interesting about this idea of the wild animals devouring the flesh of the faithful. This idea of food, the word for food here, it's the Hebrew word ma'achal. It comes from a verb, or a root that's found in a verb, achal, which means to eat. That same word appears again in verse 7 of this psalm. We'll see it in just a minute. And the nations are described as devouring the psalmist's community. So the nations are being portrayed as predatory beasts. They are monstrous predatory beasts that are devouring us, that are leading our bodies to be defiled. And I say our in the sense of the psalmist and the psalmist community. Verse 3, moreover, appears to describe a sacrilegious ceremony of sorts, in which the nations are usurping the role of God's appointed priests. Priests normally are the ones who pour out the blood of animal sacrifices. You can see especially the book of Leviticus chapter 4. But God's priests can no longer take up this role because the nations have inflicted such violence. They are taking the role of these priests, but they're doing it again in this kind of sacrilegious, subversive ceremony, right? They've defiled us and the temple in the process. Folks, it's a depiction of a truly traumatic event. So much so that the psalmist laments becoming a taunt to the neighbors, derided by those around us. Again, it's just horrific. Okay, so this gives us the context, right? This gives us some of the background. This is a psalm that describes trauma, describes communal trauma. And so after these verses, in verses 1 through 4, we come across the feature of the psalm that originally struck me as odd as I was first translating this psalm for my psalm seminar. Namely, in the ensuing verses, after this description of trauma, we see a rather disjointed focus. Sometimes the psalmist focuses on God and God's culpability in the crisis. Sometimes the psalmist focuses on the nations and their culpability in the crisis. And then sometimes the psalmist focuses on the psalmist's own community and maybe even their culpability in the crisis. So you can isolate the verses on this basis. I hope that you're able to see this. I'm sorry if the text is small. But at the very least, the colors can be a visual for you as you start to see some of the disoriented rhetoric here. So in the green up on the screen, pour out your anger on the nations that don't know you, on the kingdoms that don't call on your name. They have devoured, there's that word devoured, right? Achal. They've devoured Jacob and laid waste his habitation. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Let the avenging of the outpoured blood of your servants be known among the nations before our eyes. Return sevenfold into the bosom of our neighbors the taunts with which they taunted you. Again, there's an implied blame here, right? The nations are culpable of some kind of horrific atrocity, right? And so they need to receive response from God because of what they have done. Now, verses 8 and 9 and 11, though, it's a different focus entirely. In verse 8, don't remember against us the iniquities of our ancestors. Let your compassion come speedily to meet us. We are brought very low. Help us, O God of our salvation, for the glory of your name. Deliver us. Forgive us our sins for your name's sake. Let our groans come before you. According to your great power, preserve those doomed to die. Again, there seems to be an implied blame here that's at least acknowledged as a possibility for the psalmist's ancestors, right? Don't remember against us the iniquities of our ancestors. Forgive us our sins. Right? So the focus is internal here. And maybe there's even some implied blame that's acknowledged on the part of the psalmist and the psalmist community. And then we have verse 5. How long, O Lord, will you be angry forever? Will your jealous wrath burn like fire? Like, God, you are to blame, right? You are angry at us. It is ultimately you who has made this atrocity occur. In verse 13, again, there's no clear resolution to the psalm. But there's still this commitment to give thanks to you, O God, forever. From generation to generation, we will recount your praise. And so God seems to be the focus. God's the focus of the entire psalm, obviously, because these stipulations or petitions are being sent to God. But again, you see the disconnect, right? There's kind of this focus on God, the nations, and then the psalmist community. Now, this got me curious. As I was reading this psalm, I was noticing this kind of disoriented rhetoric. It got me super curious because I was aware, at least vaguely, of Judith Herman's important work on trauma and recovery. Again, no expert on trauma theory, but I had some colleagues who are working on reading through like kind of trauma-informed readings of the text. I read some of Judith Herman's work, so I don't have a slide for it, but Judith Herman's work is extraordinarily influential in the field of trauma studies. And so I knew vaguely from that work that trauma and recovery were increasingly being understood as social phenomena. That is, they're not just individual things that we deal with or cope with, but ideally our trauma is processed in community, right? It's processed with others. I also knew that a key part of trauma recovery was processing memories and creating a coherent narrative out of an experience or set of experiences that are profoundly disorienting. And so it made sense to me. This was kind of my tentative hypothesis early in the phase of writing this paper. Could worship facilitate recovery from communal trauma? It was a chance for a community to come together, to process grief, and to tell stories, right? So could there be something significant about this disoriented rhetoric? Right? This psalmist is grieving trauma. And worshiping communities are proclaiming these words in theory, or at least hearing them in worship. Could there be something about this psalm that could represent an act of recovery from trauma? Well, in thinking about this text and about these questions, I happened to be reading for another PhD seminar, and I ran across this concept of social identity theory. Okay, so to summarize the major premises of this framework, this isn't biblical studies, this is not any kind of religious sociology. These are sociologists who are observing how people interact in groups, right? Sociologists. So there's an entire approach to the field of social psychology called the social identity approach. If we were going to summarize the major premises of this framework, we can see it on the screen. We might say that inasmuch as individuals prefer to view themselves positively, right? You can resonate with that. We want to see ourselves as individuals positively, right? We want to say that we have value, right? We're good ultimately, right? So inasmuch as individuals want to see themselves positively, and inasmuch as individuals form their identity in community. That is, I'm not just my own thing. My identity is not just formed in a vacuum. I'm a part of communities, my family, my wife and my kids, my church, right? There's all sorts of communities that inform my sense of identity. Okay, so inasmuch as individuals prefer to see themselves positively, and inasmuch as sense of self derives from group membership, individuals define themselves positively by essentially viewing their group memberships positively. We want to view our groups, our communities, in a positive light. And how do we do that? Well, we compare ourselves with other groups, right? So again, we want to see our in-group. We want to see our church community or our family as positively distinct compared to other church communities or other families or, fill in the blank, right? So we compare ourselves. Now, these social identity researchers, again, through data collection, observation, they started to realize that there are these strategies that disadvantaged groups tend to use in order to reframe their group identity over and against competing out groups, right? To think of themselves more positively. These are called social creativity strategies. They're strategies used by disadvantaged groups to enhance their social identity in relation to comparative outgroups. This concept of social creativity strategies was particularly notable to me as I was reading about this research, because I noticed that the most common social creativity strategies identified by these social identity researchers, they're quite comparable to the disparate portions of Psalm 79 that I had identified in my reading of this psalm. Okay, so this summarizes my insights, and I'll walk you through from top to bottom, okay? So for example, first, the very top, social creativity strategy number 1, downward comparison. Researchers have shown how in-group members tend to accentuate input characteristics on which the in-group was superior while negatively evaluating the out-group on a different dimension. If I just lost you in that jargon, think about it in the context of sports, okay? Normally, when you're playing football or something, right, you're going to look at the scoreboard. That's your defining comparison, right? So think about a team that's losing. All right, we may be losing, we may have a lower score than you, but let's change the comparison dimension. We may be losing, but your team's playing dirty, you know? We may be losing, but you're playing dirty. You're playing fast and loose with the rule book, right? We're changing the comparison dimension so that the out group looks bad, okay? Or we may be losing, but you guys got the refs in your pockets, right? A certain team in the Super Bowl, you know? There's a lot of accusations about that, right? So this happens all the time. People do this all the time, right? I may be losing, I may be disadvantaged, or, you know, but your group, there's something off there. There's some other dimension with which you are you know, less than me and less than my group. Okay, so for the author of Psalm 79, those petitions that focus on the nations, they fall into this category. For the author of Psalm 79, even though comparative outgroups, the nations, are in a position of relative political strength, a positive in-group identity is reinforced through villainization of other nations for their arrogance and for their sacrilege. We may be afflicted, but again, you don't know God. Like, you are arrogant. So the list goes on, right? We may be afflicted, but the nations are arrogant and sacrilegious. Social creativity strategy number 2. Researchers have found that groups may redefine the valence assigned to a negatively distinguishing dimension of the in-group to make it less disparaging. In other words, we have a comparison dimension, and we want to reframe it as maybe not being that bad. Okay, so in the context of sports, we may be losing, but this is a chance for us to learn, you know, to get better, right? Us losing is a chance for us to make sure this never happens again, right? We're going to have a come to Jesus meeting. We've learned what we did wrong, right? Again, we do this all the time. We're going to take a negatively distinguishing dimension, comparison dimension, and we're going to reframe it as being really not that bad after all, okay? Now, this is what the psalmist does in those petitions that focus on the psalmist community. We may be afflicted, but afflicting could actually be a good thing because God responds to those who are afflicted. God cares for the vulnerable, right? And so maybe, just maybe, our affliction, it's not unequivocally good, but it can inspire God's compassion and it can inspire God's action. Okay, third, researchers have discovered that groups may enhance perceptions of the in-group on a dimension other than the distinguishing dimension. So this differs from social creativity strategy number 1 because, again, we're focusing on the nations. We're focusing on the out-group with the first one. With the third one, we're focusing now on a completely different comparison dimension entirely for the in-group. This relates, I think, to verses 5 and 13, especially verse 13 of this psalm. Namely, the psalmist in these verses, especially verse 13, stops focusing on affliction entirely. Affliction doesn't actually define us. This is not the primary comparison that we should be focusing on. Instead, the psalmist does something remarkable. Do you remember? Do you remember what the psalmist does in verse 13? I'll read it for you again. We, your people, the flock of your pasture. It's interesting language, by the way. Flock. The psalmist community has been slaughtered at the hands of the nations. Right? It's a multivalent concept, right? But we, your people, the flock of your pasture, we will give thanks to you forever. From generation to generation, we will recount your praise. Without any clear resolution to the crisis, what does the psalmist do? He commits the community to worship. We may be afflicted, but our affliction doesn't define us. Instead, our identity is first and foremost rooted in our commitment to worship God alone. Okay, so hear me out. I think it's notable, for what it's worth, that the disorientation of Psalm 79, right, reading it slowly, seeing kind of the disparate focus that we've talked about, I think it's interesting that this exposes the interweaving of these three social creativity strategies, right? It kind of reveals some of the narratives that the worshiping community is telling, right? Because, again, we tell stories in our worship, and so the psalmist community, they're telling stories together, and these are stories that are helping them to process this catastrophe. And I think that's notable in and of itself. It's important to be aware of the stories we tell in our worship. But I would add one thing. I'm not sure that all three of these creativity strategies are created equal for the psalmist and the psalmist community. Because it's, after all, the third strategy that forms a frame in verses 5 and 13. It ends the psalm without any clear resolution. Moreover, it constitutes the conceptual basis for the rest of the psalm. This is a worship text, right? So the commitment to worship is allowing the open line of communication in the first place with God, right? If the covenant is not intact, right? If the people don't have access to God, what's the point in even telling these first two stories, right? The first two social creativity strategies. It's the third one which ends the psalm without any clear resolution to the chaotic life setting. And so my thesis for the article is that the psalm's medium and message enable recovery from its traumatic life setting. Worship becomes a way to ritualize resilience in the wake of communal trauma. Now, this article, for what it's worth, it changed a lot for me as both a worship leader and as a researcher. So I'm going to talk about worship leading for just a minute, okay? And then we'll come back to the research side of things. As a worship leader, I came to realize that worship can be a powerful act of identity formation. A lot of times when I grew up, I was thinking about worship as something that I offer to God, right? It's some kind of like sacrifice, right? It's something that I do for God. And I think, totally legitimate. There's good theological basis for seeing sacrifice as a key component of what we do in our worship. So again, don't want to push that away. But how often do we think about how worship forms us? That worship is a moment in which we gather together in community, in which our identities are formed. So as a worship leader, I came to realize that worship can be a powerful act of identity formation that could even be so powerful in theory to aid groups recovering from affliction, like what we see in Psalm 79. The caveat here, don't hear me saying that those who have experienced trauma just need to worship more. That's not the takeaway. Some worship is probably actually detrimental to our sense of identity, for what it's worth. Professional help is available by trained counselors and therapists for good reason. So don't hear that. But what I am suggesting is that worship is a powerful event that forms us as individuals and communities. Worship is storytelling, performing stories that we value. This is maybe most obvious in an event like the Lord's Supper, where we have symbols that allow us to connect with and actually mimic Jesus at a specific moment in his life. But I think this observation is also obvious when you start to think about other often unspoken aspects of our worship, right? Like the arrangement of our furniture. Most worship spaces that I've been a part of look a lot like this at Robinson, the auditorium. It's rather sterile, not a lot of art or color, a rather clear hierarchy of priorities, baptistry up top, pulpit in the middle, Lord's table at the bottom. Then, of course, notice all the pews face the front, where there's really only one room, really room for one person to speak at a time, right? We're a community, but we're a certain kind of community. We're an audience, right? And of course we sing together, but is this arrangement the most conducive to singing? Well, no, probably not. This is a good arrangement for a lecture, or maybe a sermon. And incidentally, sermons tend to be the centerpiece of many Christian communities, churches of Christ certainly, in our worship time together. And I don't point this out in order to critique this model of worship at all. But rather to just acknowledge that this model promotes certain values. We're telling stories. We're conveying what we value when we worship like this. We value preaching in churches of Christ. We value the mind. We value knowing the right things. And I'm grateful for that because that's what led me into scholarship, right? So just to be very clear, like I value the mind too. Robinson valued those things as well. But they also valued something else that was quite beautiful and I think Christ-like, if I may. You see, members at Robinson like to view themselves as a family. It was actually in the church's vision statement. They said that we are a family that's committed to creating spaces of belonging so that we can become like Jesus and bless the world. So at Robinson, as their worship leader and eventually their associate minister, I began to ask in consultation with the church's elders and lead minister, how would a family worship? What would that look like? The more we thought about it, well, families probably wouldn't meet just in a massive auditorium where we looked at the back of each other's heads. Families would worship probably in a circle, maybe around a table, maybe in a smaller space. Families might even dialogue with one another, cut up in worship a little bit. They'd certainly pray for one another. So as a congregation, then we wondered, like, how could we retain what we valued in our normal worship time while moving the furniture around, both literally and figuratively? We wanted to be intentional about the stories that we were telling in our worship. To be clear, I don't claim that our solution was the most elegant or that it should be replicated elsewhere or even done permanently at Robinson, okay? So that's not what I'm advocating for. But for Robinson, while I was there, we found a rhythm in which once a month we decided to move out of the auditorium into our fellowship room where we worshiped around tables. We still prayed, but the prayer time was done around tables so that people could share and pray for one another. We still had a sermon and read scripture, but we also made time for dialogue about our sermon and about scripture. We still took communion, but we looked one another in the eyes while we did it. We still sang songs, but we also got the kids more directly involved. We had a rug in the middle, so these came to affectionately be known as rug services over time because the kids just loved the rug. It was amazing for them. So hear me out. Again, this is unique to Robinson. This was our church's vision statement. It's what we were thinking at the time. But for a church that was lamenting its empty auditorium, that needed to practice healthy dialogue because we were divided as a church, these table services became a powerful event that formed us and that helped us to recover from our sense of loss. We at Robinson may have been afflicted, but we were a family, committed to creating spaces of belonging so that we could become like Jesus and bless the world. And so the research for this article, then, it made a difference for my life as a worship leader and associate minister, but it did far more than that. It also impacted my approach to my research. So if you'll allow me, I think I've got 6 minutes or so before I want to close this up and give us a chance for dialogue if you're interested. I want to conclude this first presentation by laying a little bit of groundwork for where we're going to go in part 2, where we really dig in to Deuteronomy. A lot of this is the rationale for why I do what I do. But you see, if worship really is a powerful act of identity formation, we might say that with great power comes great responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Worship can bind us together as communities of faith, intent upon serving God and others well, but it can also promote less desirable behaviors. Ritual theorists, that is, researchers that study the social and psychological effects of religious ritual, they also acknowledge the power of ritual to form us and even to incite violence. One of those theorists, again, this is not a Christian researcher, okay? This is just somebody who studies rituals. A handshake is a ritual, right? Worship is also a ritual. But Scott Draper, one of these ritual theorists, he's made this observation in his book, Religious Interaction Ritual. I'm going to read to you kind of the whole quote. I've got just the final sentence up on the screen. But Scott Draper says this: to the extent that members of an organization are able to stimulate powerful emotional experiences in each other's presence, they become more collectively certain about why they're special, why they're good, and why they're right. Again, worship forms us. It teaches us what we should think about one another and about what's right. The spirit of certainty flourishes when they're able to pit their own, version of solidarity against that of an enemy who's clearly incapable of distinguishing right from wrong and true from false. And then when groups tell each other that the enemy poses an imminent threat, two things are likely to happen to them. Their unity will abound, that is, the group's kind of social solidarity, it's going to be reinforced, but some type of battle will ensue with the outgroup, right? Maybe that battle's violent, Maybe it's not. Maybe our words can be violence, right? Or our actions can be violent in some ways. Right, here's the final sentence of the paragraph, which I think is interesting. The spirit of unity and that of discord, unity and disunity, are in practice intimately bound together. Okay, Draper, this is obvious, right? But I think it's worth mentioning. Draper's acknowledging two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, worship allows communities to perform their values, and in doing so, to become more certain of who they are. On the other hand, when a worshiping community is certain of its identity, and it's faced with an outside force or threat, worship can actually stimulate conflict and potentially even violence in some cases. Enter the book of Deuteronomy. My interest in the book of Deuteronomy came when I had a startling realization. And maybe you've had this too, reading the book of Deuteronomy. I don't know how often you're reading the book of Deuteronomy, but if you are, you probably noticed this pretty quickly. On the one hand, Deuteronomy has one of the most consequential worship innovations in the entire Bible. Okay, it's the chart at the very top. You can see this. It's the centralization of worship at one place. Okay? What's really fascinating about this is if you look elsewhere at other law codes in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books of the Bible, you look at other law codes like Exodus chapter 20. It initiates this law code called the Covenant Code, or the Book of the Covenant, right? This is the stipulations of a covenant that God makes with Moses at Mount Sinai, right? And in the text, it refers to this collection of laws, it seems, as the Book of the Covenant. So this is the so-called Covenant Code, or the Book of the Covenant. And you may notice in this Covenant Code, there's a recognition that, well, you can offer sacrifices, quote, in every place where I, that is God, cause my name to be remembered. There seems to be some realization that you can worship at multiple sites, multiple places, right? There's going to be multiple places where you can offer sacrifices. For what it's worth, scholars regularly see connections between Deuteronomy and the so-called Covenant Code. So it seems as though Deuteronomy is interacting in some ways with the Covenant Code, Deuteronomy's author. But you'll notice a significant difference here. Only at the place, singular, that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do everything that I command you. All throughout chapter 12, you only worship at the place, the place, the place. And then the rest of Deuteronomy's legal material, again, it's all about that place, okay? I've got a few examples up there of rhetoric about the place, but it's everywhere. It pervades the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so we have worship centralization. You worship at this one place in the book of Deuteronomy. And again, chapter 12 is where you really see just over and over again this language about worshiping at the place. The very next chapter, chapter 13, 3 case studies where people are committing apostasies, and they're leading, in theory, you to worship in a way that you shouldn't, to worship other gods or, disobey Deuteronomy's commandments in some way. And the call in Deuteronomy 13, time and time again, is to kill those people. Anybody that is a threat to your loyalty to God alone, you put them to death. Summary execution. Or even worse, if it's a city, you devote it to the harem, right? Harem is this kind of literally the language of sacrifice is actually used in Deuteronomy 13. It's a kalil to God. The city becomes this offering to God, right? You destroy it, its inhabitants, all of its plunder. That's Deuteronomy chapter 13. I told you worship is powerful. It's powerful enough to be a medium in which a community of exiles generates resilience in the face of tremendous catastrophe. It's powerful because it forms groups and tells them what to be certain of. But does worship also divide us from others? Does it erect impenetrable barriers that perhaps even lead to violence, like what we see in the book of Deuteronomy? I hope you'll be present at our second presentation so that you can find out a little bit more. Okay, so I look forward to that. Thank you all so much for your time, your presence, and your attention. And I hope you can join us at our second presentation where we're going to dig deep into the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, thank you. Do you want to do some times for questions if you all have any, if you'd like to dialogue about any of this. I have plenty of questions, too, for what it's worth, so that's just the nature of these things. Sure.
Connect the dots for me a little bit between Psalm 79 and the trauma theory. So, how are you thinking through what is happening in Psalm 79 like they just came at this naturally, or
Yeah.
I don't know. What connect dots for me?
Yeah. So I think. I do think that like trauma theorists, sociologists, they're describing common features of the human condition. I mean, obviously different cultures are bound by different cultural norms and they have different values. But I do think there's this, trauma is pervasive in human existence. I would contend we all experience communal grief and affliction. And so I think the insight of trauma theorists is that, it's most productive, it's most constructive to process grief and trauma in community. And so my interest in all of this is just thinking about, well, how are ancient worshiping communities processing their trauma in worship specifically? And I think it is notable that, again, they're using strategies that are at least comparable to what contemporary communities use.
So I think you referenced, what was that, a particular article that you were using for trauma theory?
Yes. Yeah. So again, what I'm doing formally is not necessarily trauma theory. I'm not applying like Judith Herman's framework for trauma theory to the reading of the text. Some people do that. Rebecca Pohays is a scholar that's done that. Instead, I was just interested by Judith Herman's research. It just made me wonder, again, how is identity formation occurring in this psalm? And so social identity theory, social identity approach, which is what I did cite up there, one article among many, this is just a broad framework that's, again, thinking about how groups relate to each other. So it's not formally trauma theory, but I might call this a trauma-informed reading, right? I'm trying to be sensitive to the traumatic origins of the text and trying to draw then from the insights of contemporary sociologists to think about how identity formation is happening for the psalmist and the psalmist community. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Did you have a question as well or comment?
Yeah, I've got one that I'll save for later. That one was close enough to my first
Yeah.
But one about some of my doctoral students' research that's more inside baseball stuff. But,
Yeah, so much of what I do as a scholar, this is actually very kind of like outside of my comfort zone, doing like a sociological reading of the text. That's not how I'm trained. I'm trained as a historian. But a lot of what I see my role as a historian as, I see my role as engaging in cross-cultural communication, right? We're communing with the dead, right? And so there's a sense in which I want to promote this idea that these texts are, especially Psalms, these are texts used by worshiping communities, like real people who are dealing with real grief. And so for me, if we can learn from the insights of sociologists or those who are being attuned to the human condition, I think there's fruit there, right? I think we can connect with ancient humans on a very real human level, right? Develop empathy at the very least. And hopefully inspiration for our own worship, right? Thinking about the power of worship to form us. This is just a starting point in that regard, right? I haven't really proven anything or shown anything other than for this psalm, worship is a key aspect of identity formation. But like how? How does that work? Well, each congregation is working that out on the ground floor every week, right? And so maybe the big takeaway then is for those of you who are in churches, man, your worship is powerful. Take it seriously. Take it seriously. Think about the stories you're telling, and what are you promoting through the way your furniture's arranged, through again, I think it matters. So yeah.
Since that what we just said kind of took it in that direction, one of my doctoral students is finishing up a project thinking about biblical mandate for inclusion for the aging and elderly, and then comparing that and looking at how technology in worship has changed, thinking about like online live streams, and sort of the distance between, okay, on one hand, these technologies are a great source of potential inclusion. Also on a practical basis, we saw a lot of folks having a lot of difficulty with that. Lack of access, lack of, ability to familiar with those things. And I was just thinking here while you were talking about what that next step, not even thinking about like the space, physical space of worship, but even taking that like kind of outside of the church walls as well. There's not really a question there, but just, I was really interested to hear this. She turned in her conclusion this morning, so this is what I've got on my brain right now. But I was really encouraged to see this and thinking about some of the changes that Robinson made, even kind of on a temporary, otherwise basis. I was wondering if you had given any thought if the church was involved in doing like live streaming, or if the change of format impacts that.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we had a woman who was in my small group. We were very good friends with her, but she was in a wheelchair, and so she had to stay home a lot of times if like the van that transported her was broken, and it broke a lot because it was old, and we didn't have enough money to get like a really good van that was reliable. So she was always, we always wanted to include her. And so we had, we would just FaceTime with her. A lot of times, because we knew that she wanted to be a part of the community. But again, it's not the most elegant solution. I think, though, that there is kind of this distinction to be made maybe between even the concepts of inclusion and belonging. Right? And so for us at Robinson, we were actively asking, what's the difference between, on the one hand, saying we want to include, we want to make space for everybody, if they're willing to jump through the hurdles that we have in place. That's kind of maybe more inclusion. But what does it look like to actually prioritize belonging, to like literally rearrange the furniture, to make decisions about technology that have those who are, in her situation most in view? And it's incredibly challenging, but I was heartened that they were asking the question in the first place. And again, it's not that hard to FaceTime her, but again, I think the church has a lot of creativity, needs to be thinking more about this, and could probably profit from the research that your student's been working on.
Here, stay up here just a second. Well, I want to say thank you very much, Clay. That was really well done. As a presentation, it was interesting. That's an accomplishment right there. Presenting scholarly research in an interesting way. We get some scholars, not everybody knows how to do that. So, yeah, excellent. The content was really well done as well, just in terms of teaching us something about the Psalms, teaching us something about some social identity theory that I had never heard of anyway, and then thinking about how it all affects modern worship. So thank you very much. This was great. Makes us all excited about what's coming up at 6 o'clock. I do have a plaque for you to commemorate this research lectures. So this is Graduate Research Lectures, March 6th, 2025, presented to H. Clay Smith in recognition of his outstanding contributions to scholarship and ministry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thank you for being here. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll be dismissed until 6 o'clock.